Welcome to the menu on Native America Calling. I'm Andy Murphy. Two works, one in book form and another on film, look at how a handful of determined people can make a big difference. URAC attorney and conservationist Amy Bowers-Cordalis writes about the long path to bring about the biggest river reclamation project in U.S. history. And Oscar-nominated actor Lily Gladstone lends her voice to a documentary about returning buffalo to the Blackfeet people of Montana. We'll hear about those projects and reflect on a year of federal funding uncertainty for Native food and agriculture, all after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. During World War II, Japanese Americans were held captive in 10 internment camps throughout the U.S., 2 of them in Arizona, built on reservations without tribal consent. In our last story, we heard how the Colorado River Indian tribes in western Arizona has made a point to preserve the remnants of one such wartime prison. Today, KJZZ's Gabriel Pietrorazio takes us to the state's other side, which sits well hidden in the shadows of Phoenix, slowly fading away atop of the Gila River Indian community.
I had the privilege to see this restricted site twice this year with the tribe's Wally Jones, who supervised my trip.
I can't give really the location I wanted to, but people do search it.
We first met in April at the Chevron gas station in Batechul, about 30 miles south of downtown Phoenix. The tribe did not allow KJZZ to record inside the camp itself, but Jones agreed to let me document our short ride there. No matter who is coming out, Jones stresses they're not tours.
This is not a tourist camp. This is a regulated entry that the department processes for the council's consideration for your visit. It's not just anyone can come out here. These are one of the few sites that the community allows non-members to come in and kind of experience what was here.
What was here in 1942 would have equated to Arizona's 4th largest city, home to over 13,000 internees stuck in the Sonoran Desert.
The camp is not maintained. The community has decided to let nature recapture its natural state, but there are remnants of various barracks, facilities,
and at least 230 ornate garden ponds, now dried up, that prisoners built.
It always amazes me that we find these ponds out here that it was a signal of their tradition and their hope that they would not let their culture fade away.
7 months later, I returned, this time not on my own, but as a guest of the Japanese American Citizens League in a caravan of at least 20 vehicles.
And I was really touched by how emotionally connected the Gila River Indian community was in welcoming the Japanese Americans.
That's Bill Staples Jr., president of the JACL Arizona chapter. I caught up with him at the tribe's Hohokam Heritage Center after a November ceremony. Also there, making the trip from Seattle, was 85-year-old camp survivor Sylvia Domoto.
They've been so welcoming and continue to respect and to keep the land there so that we can say, yes, this really happened. It isn't just a fantasy.
For National Native News, I'm Gabriel Pietrorazio reporting from the Gila River Indian Reservation.
A new law in California aimed at preventing suicides is taking effect in the new year. The measure requires the transportation and public health departments to identify best practices and countermeasures to avoid suicides on state bridges and overpasses. The bill by Native American Assemblymember James Ramos builds on his previous work, which includes measures to improve mental health services and the establishment of a suicide prevention office. I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Kawanak Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support from Clarkson Potter, publisher of Turtle Island, Foods and Traditions of the Indigenous Peoples of North America by Native American chef Sean Sherman. With ancestral and modern recipes, this cookbook showcases diverse foodways of the continent's regions.
Skugtash. For more than 40 years, Ramona Farms has revived ancient traditional foods, tepary beans, pinoli, polentas, and more, all from store.ramonafarms.com. Ramona Farms supports this show. Tomye.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is the menu on Native America Calling, our regular feature on Indigenous food, news, and stories. I'm Andy Murphy. Amy Bowers-Cordalis is an instrumental voice in the largest river reclamation project in U.S. history. She worked in her tribe's decades-long push to have 4 dams on the Klamath River dismantled to restore salmon populations that had all but disappeared. We'll hear from her about what drives her passion to preserve her tribe's connections to their cultural environment. It took the Blackfeet Nation decades to get buffalo back on their land. The film Bring Them Home documents the political and logistical hurdles the tribe endured to make that happen. We'll talk with the people who put that film together, but first, let's get a look at what the past year has meant for tribes and the organizations that have up to now depended on federal money to grow and process food. You can join by calling 1-800-996-2848. That's 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now from Siloam Springs, Arkansas, is Carly Griffith-Hotvet. She's the executive director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, and she's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. Welcome back to the menu, Carly.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Has your organization been able to quantify the effect that federal funding and staff cuts has had on tribes and tribally run organizations you work with?
So if we're looking at it from a financial perspective or from a headcount perspective, when we're looking at staff cuts, we have not. And a large part of that reason is because there is not consistent publication of data that's coming from federal sources. We don't know exactly how many contracts were cut, who has had funding rescinded, how many staff or full-time employee positions that has impacted. Just because we haven't seen that data being reported in a consistent and searchable format. There have been some groups that have been able to, compile some information, but it's not complete. That's kind of consistent with a lot of federal data publications. We've seen, some data sets like the race and demographic breakouts from the Census of Agriculture disappear from federal websites. In addition to some health data, we're also not seeing, new data being reported in a way that we would previously expect under prior administrations. So unfortunately, no, we've not been able to quantify the complete impact of federal funding cuts or staff rescissions.
Okay. Do you see any long-term effects to tribal food and agriculture?
Oh, yeah. There were some tribes that have had, for example, the climate funding initiatives that came out under the Biden administration, the majority of those ones were clawed back. And so some tribes and tribal organizations that have had awards to administer those were no longer able to complete those projects that they were working on. And some organizations had seen, up to like 75% staffing impacts because they had so many jobs that were reliant on those types of funds. So we're definitely seeing, pretty significant impacts, not only from a staffing perspective, but, some tribes, in addition to having, funding completely rescinded, it was also frozen. Some tribes that were ready to, or start a project for dam removal, for example, were no longer able to know that they were going to get reimbursed for the work that they were going to do under what they understood to be an agreement with the federal government to do so. And so a lot of projects like that would have been environmentally impactful or impactful for, developing tribal food systems, had the brakes put on them, and some ended completely. And so it's definitely going to result in some chilling effect when it comes to, tribal food and environmental investments.
Okay. How has what's happened in the past year changed the outlook for the coming year?
So a lot of the things that we're seeing is there's a lot of hesitancy. A lot of tribes and tribal organizations are being a lot more conservative when it comes to what their growth is looking like. Some are also intentionally looking to reduce staff to make sure that they can continue to pay folks that they currently have on board. We're also seeing a pivot from, that rapid type of growth that tribes were able to do when they were able to consistently leverage federal funding in a way that they could anticipate appropriately. And now we're seeing a lot of volatility when it comes to, what funding is available and can be used to do development and growth in these areas. And so we're seeing, a slowdown when it comes to those types of food systems and agricultural investments.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the elimination of diversity initiatives at the federal level. Is that having an effect on programs that you are involved with or tribes are involved with?
Yeah. We have seen under previous administrations a push for any time that there was federal funding that was coming out, we were frequently seeing that if a group was going to apply for it and they intended to serve Indian country, you had to have a letter of support or, a reflection of a partnership with a tribe or tribal organization to show that, there was consistency in that delivery of the service is actually going to happen. That kind of stuff is not being required anymore. We are also seeing that, especially in institutions of higher education, a lot of the initiatives related to diversity, those programs have been eliminated and those positions have been eliminated. It's also affecting corporate America to the point where, many really big corporations that have previously focused on DEI initiatives have eliminated those initiatives or even changed the titles or eliminated the positions completely of the folks that were working in those spaces. And so that's all in response to the current administration's prioritization and, looking to be aligned with that. So we're definitely seeing impacts of those DEI initiatives that are being eliminated and frequently some confusion about what tribes are. Do they fall under that or not? And the answer is no. Tribes are politically based sovereigns rather than race-based groups. We are politically distinct and politically sovereign, and therefore our treatment and consideration should be based on that, not predicated on a race-based distinction.
Mm-hmm. All right. And earlier in the year, the new Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, says a reorganization is on the way for the USDA. What is the status of that, and how would that affect tribes?
So the reorganization has not occurred to date. The intent is to decentralize many of the programs at USDA that are headquartered within Washington, D.C. to different offices across the United States, Kansas City, Salt Lake City. There's, a few in those areas. Fort Collins, Colorado is another one. And the intent or the rhetoric that's coming from USDA is that it's intended to embed these programs in locations that are closer and more accessible to the people. The impacts that are going to occur for that is we're going to see continued staff attrition through the, buyout programs called the DRP, and then the term that employees at USDA were encouraged to take. That's resulted in attrition within offices. Staff that had been there less than a year were terminated at the beginning of this year, and so that resulted in a lot of additional vacancies. Some offices are seeing, up to 30-40% vacancies. It's even worse at BIA, which is under Department of Interior, not under USDA. But we are seeing that that is resulting in a lack of access to service because of, and when folks are being required to move to these new locations, they likely will not want to uproot their families and transfer. We saw that happen when a chunk of USDA was relocated to Kansas City under the first Trump administration. and a lot of folks did not, transfer with their jobs to that location. They resigned instead. It's likely that a lot of those positions that are resigned likely won't be filled in any kind of timely fashion or at all. And so the result is going to be a lack of service because of a lack of staff being able to deliver that service. The other issue is when a lot of tribes come to Washington, D.C. to do lobbying or to receive education or to engage with, administrative political appointees, D.C. is kind of a one-stop shop. You can hit USDA, Congress, Department of Interior, Treasury, wherever else that you need to go in a 1 or 2 day jaunt. When you have sections of each department being scattered across the United States, it makes it very difficult to meet with the program specialists that each tribe really needs to get in there with. So if USDA has, the National Institute for Food and Agriculture that funds tribal colleges and universities in one location versus the Farm Service Agency leadership in another location versus the Natural Resource Conservation Service in another location, it makes it very, very difficult to be able to engage with all of those programs that are incredibly impactful for Indian country.
Okay. And what should tribes be keeping an eye on for the future when it comes to agriculture?
So for the future for agriculture, this isn't specific to agriculture, but there recently some updated regulations related to the U.S. Treasury's treatment of tribal tax considerations, and this created a lot of flexibility as far as what types of income are taxable or what types of services or benefits are taxable that a tribe issues or shares with its citizens. And so that's creating a lot more flexibility when it comes to what type of investments tribes are willing to make and how they make sure those resources are shared. So that's a positive, and that's going to be impactful for food and agriculture as well. We're still waiting on a farm bill. I don't know if we are going to get one, with the current Congress or the current administration. Midterms are coming up. We haven't ever gotten a farm bill in an election year. And so I think we're still going to be waiting on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, it's been a couple of expiration dates we've passed for that farm bill, but we'll be back right after this break. You are listening to The Menu on Native America Calling.
In addition to several notable independent films, it was a year of mainstream TV shows incorporating Native American storylines. From a Native writer and director's take on a gritty detective drama to a fictional tribe's connection to a menacing circus clown. We'll talk about the year in film and TV on the next Native America Calling.
Who protects Indian country? Amerind does. As the only 100% tribally owned insurance carrier, Amerind helps strengthen tribal communities by providing reliable insurance coverage and keeping dollars in Indian country. From property and liability to commercial auto and tribal workers' compensation, Amerind is here to protect what matters. Celebrating 40 years of serving Indian country. Learn more at amerind.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Thanks for tuning in to The Menu on Native America Calling. I'm Andy Murphy, and we're talking about food and food sovereignty today. You can join our conversation with Amy Bowers-Cordalis, who is a Yurok river conservationist, with your questions or comments. If you have them, we're at 1-800-996-2848. That's 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now from the village of Requoy on the Yurok Reservation is Amy Bowers-Cordalis. She's the executive director of the Ridges to Rifles Indigenous Conservation Group. Her new memoir is titled The Water Remembers, and she's Yurok. Welcome to the menu, Amy.
Tuenakoi, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. You've talked a lot about the ecological disaster that sparked a lifetime of environmental preservation. It was watching tens of thousands of salmon die because of policy decisions to divert water away from the salmon. You were very young at that time. This was about 2002. But you must have had an understanding before that about what your core beliefs are. Have you ever reflected on that?
Often. In 2002, I witnessed the largest fish kill in American history occur on the Klamath River, on my reservation. Over 70,000 adult salmon died as a result of bad water management and the legacy impacts of colonization of the Klamath River. And I just remember I was working for tribal fisheries that summer, and my job had been to count the tribal harvest. And so every day I was on the river meeting with the tribal families at the fish camps, counting their fish. And, you know, I remember being in the boat and watching the fish, you know, die. And they were just, you know, floating dead down the river. And I had a lot of thoughts. You know, the first was there's nothing in Yurok's history like that. You know, so this wasn't a natural occurrence. We have been on the Klamath River since time immemorial, and nothing like that had ever happened. So that was one thing. And then two, I realized, you know, we were still, as Yurok people, under attack. The fish kill was an act of ecocide against the Yurok people, and it had happened in 2002. You know, and I had naively thought that my nation had ended the war with the U.S. government, but there we were. You know, I'm looking at these dead fish and realizing, no, we are still under attack. And then my next thought, and actually I was in the boat and I really had this like existential experience where my great grandmother, who had passed by then, but who had lived through some really, really tough times. She was born in the early 1900s and was raised by her grandparents and, you know, lived this Aboriginal lifestyle and then was taken to boarding schools, but then was able to come back. And she just was a hardcore advocate for Yurok rights. And I just felt her move through me and say, it's your turn to fight now. And you know, I, at that point, had the great privilege and honor of having been, you know, raised within Yurok culture and knew enough about my duties as a Yurok person to protect and restore and fight for the river and speak for the salmon and the river when it needs help. I write about all this in the book, but as Yurok people, we, you know, the creator basically told us this was all made for you and you'll never want for anything so long as you live in a balance with it. And so what that means is we as Yuroks have the great privilege of being the beneficiaries of the abundance of the lower Klamath Basin. But with that privilege comes responsibilities and duties to protect. So there, you know, in 2002, I'm witnessing this act of ecocide, the fish are dying, And, I got very clear instruction from my ancestors, you exercise your responsibilities. And I'll never understand this part of it, but it was what it was. My next thought was, I'm going to law school, and, I'm going to hopefully create the skills and abilities and get the experience to represent my tribe, to fight to protect this river. And so for me, that direction and instruction was to be a lawyer to exercise those responsibilities. But that moment, watching the fish kill, that galvanized a whole new generation of indigenous peoples into the fight to save our way of life. And, others became biologists, grassroots activists, scientists, cultural practitioners, but the fish kill in itself pulled us all together to collectively fight for our culture and our future. And it really became the ultimate exercise of self-determination and sovereignty.
Right. You also write a lot about your father and his influence on you as someone who's so involved in fishing, habitat preservation, and traditional practices. What do you want to also say about your father?
Well, he's a remarkable man. He currently serves as a Yurok tribal court judge, but he's in that role because he carries important cultural knowledge about our values as Yurok people, and also he's a hardcore fisherman, and so he's been a part of the community here. At Yurok, we're really lucky because we were never relocated, and so we've been able, through all those fights that I talk about in the book, through the generations, we've been able to stay on our home waters and our homelands and continue our fishing way of life. And for my dad, he just was he's been a remarkable father and person who's been able to pass down those traditions of fishing to my family and to many other Yurok people. And through that, he taught us what it was to be Yurok, and being able as an indigenous person to, continue to exercise your cultural traditions. And the act of fishing for us is a core of our culture. And so passing that down, teaching us to understand how to interact with the river, where the fish are, why they're there, and also teaching us the values behind fishing. There's rules around fishing, and that informs our relationship to make sure that we don't overharvest in our own practices. And he taught us that. And in the book, I write about, and kind of sprinkled throughout the whole book, it always comes back to fishing with my dad. And I really wanted to uplift that narrative because I think it's so important to show the world an example of, a good Native father and a good Native man who's out there doing the best he can to protect and, provide for his family. So it's a great, just a great privilege, and I love him dearly.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of providing for your family, providing for the family, you share a lot of stories also of the time when it was literally illegal for Yurok to fish, to practice this traditional harvest. Talk a little bit about that and how that, sort of adds to this story of yours.
Fishing for Yurok is the ultimate act of protest, resistance, and sovereignty. Through colonization, they tried to remove us from our lands, from our waters, and from our fishing way of life because that's a means of control. In California, by about 1910, over 90% of California's indigenous population had been slaughtered. The remaining 10%, was that my family was a part of that remaining 10%. And then remarkably, we were able to stay on our lands. But, they still tried to, through various laws. 1933, the state of California passed a law that prohibited Yurok people from fishing on our own reservation where the state had no jurisdiction. And for us, trying to make fishing illegal is like making breathing illegal. It is so core to who we are. And so we fought back. And my great uncle's Supreme Court case in 1973 affirmed that the Yurok reservation was still Indian country and the state had no jurisdiction. And that was the Supreme Court, and I write about this in the book, and how the family talked about this was that that was the highest court of the land, and it should have been the end of our fight. But instead, in 1978, the federal government put a full moratorium on all Yurok fishing, again, kicking us off the river, and that launched us into the salmon wars. And, that was a situation where the feds sent out, we called them a goon squad, and they were, federal marshals with full riot gear and machine guns and big jet boats. And, they sent them out to the river, and we would go out in our little teeny, rowboats, basically just wood rowboats, and we would gill net fish as an act of protest. And the goon squad would come and try to take the nets away. And I write about in the book one powerful moment where there was a very dangerous interaction between the federal marshals and my great-grandmother and grandma, who were at the time older women, petite women, just out there on the boat fishing by themselves. And it was dangerous. They were going to get hurt. And my great-grandmother stood up in the boat and sang a Yurok song and called in the birds, and the birds scared away the federal marshals, and they actually never came back. Mm-hmm. And so, then you sort of get to this moment in the mid-'80s or the early '80s where we think everything's going to be okay, where we had confirmed our right to fish. There were still sort of healthy populations, but then they start to decline, and the salmon populations returning each year get smaller and smaller, and we realize it's because of the dams. It's because of bad water management, and then that's where I come along, and the fish kill happened, and it launched, us into this other fight to protect the salmon, because what good is a right, a treaty right, a reserved right for fishing if there are no salmon to fish? And so it's been this big, long journey, and I'm really happy to report that, and this is a spoiler alert for the book, but the Indians won, y'all. Like, we won. We got those dams out of the river, and now the salmon are returning. The river is healthier and more vibrant and alive than I have ever seen it in my life. And so it's just been a huge honor to be able to tell one story of, what happened. There are so many champions of Klamath Dam removal, and my story is just one. I hope more stories will be told, but I really wanted it to be out in Indian country that, like, when we work together, when we use our culture, when we use grassroots, when we use our strong medicine, when we use our sovereignty to protect our homelands and our waters, and also when we persevere, when we continue through the generations, we will be victorious. Indian country will rise, and I believe that, and that's what we're seeing on the Klamath now.
Right, and that's what you totally get from reading the book. You describe connections to the river and all of these fights that took place over multiple generations of Yurok people and multiple generations of your family. And it's such a long road that you document in the book, and you eventually had to convince the state and the energy company that operated the dams to spend $500 million just so salmon could swim free again. Did that seem like an impossible task in the beginning?
We talk a lot about this because as you describe it, it's like, whoa, that does seem like impossible task. But we were fighting for our lives. We were fighting for our future. Things were really bad on the Klamath River, right around 2016. And the fight really started right after the fish killed. But there were lots of points at which, and you could say it this way, we failed, where for whatever reason, the deal, the negotiations had stopped. And 2016 was one of those moments where we had the smallest returning run of salmon in history ever recorded. And the Yurok Tribal Council made a really hard decision to completely close the fishery to Yurok fishing. And so there's no subsistence, no commercial. And maybe a month, well, it was probably about a month, 6 weeks later, the council also declared a suicide emergency because there was a string of suicides on the Yurok reservation where our young people were taking their lives. And it was clear that for us as Yurok people, there wasn't a future if there weren't salmon. And so in the fight, the front lines fight to save the river, we were fighting to save ourselves. And when you are fighting with that urgency, failure is not an option. It was never an option to fail. What we had to do was continue to pivot and find another solution. So when one thing didn't work, we moved to the next thing. And, one of the lessons learned is we found a gazillion solutions that failed. It only took one that worked. So it speaks to preservation, resiliency, resistance, that you just keep fighting. And for us, it actually was like leaning into our partners. The dams were owned by Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world. And there was a couple things, it was honestly ceremony. There was a ceremony that was, and I write about this in the book, that was done for the first time in 100 years. It was grassroots activism that put a ton of pressure on the company. And then it was the law and policies, there was a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission proceeding, and through that, it was found that it was cheaper to remove dams than it was to install fish ladders, which would have been required in order to relicense the dams.
Okay.
And then also, the reason for that.
Amy, we're going to go to a break just right now. We'll let you finish just right after. We'll be back with Amy Bowers-Cordalis right after this break.
Support for law and justice-related programming provided by Hobbs, Strauss, Dean & Walker, LLP, a national law firm dedicated to promoting and defending tribal rights for over 40 years. More information available at hobbsstrauss.com.
Kaufman & Associates has over 35 years of experience serving Indian country, supporting growth, transformation, and sustainability of tribal programs. More at kaufmaninc.com, KAUFFMANINC.com.
You're listening to The Menu today on Native America Calling, our regular feature on Indigenous food sovereignty. I'm Andy Murphy. We're hearing about efforts to restore access to traditional food sources today, and you can join us by calling 1-800-996-2848. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. I want to go back to our guest, Amy Bowers-Cordalis from the Yurok Nation here. Amy, just before the break, you were talking about challenges to dam removal and finding that one solution that worked. What did dam removal? What was that experience like for you?
Man, well, watching it was unbelievable. It was surreal. I was honored to get the opportunity to write about it because it was so deeply moving. So to process all of that emotion through writing the book was really a profound experience for me. I grew up hearing the stories that many of the stories I share in the book. And when I went to law school, I learned more about the status of Indian rights in the law. And it was really empowering for me to put together these stories of resistance, the Supreme Court case, my great uncle Ray was arrested 19 times by the state of California just for fishing on our home waters, under a reserved right. So the fish wars, like learning all about that and then being able to understand the law around it and seeing how those reserved rights, our rights that were reserved by our ancestors, our inherent rights, and understanding that those were vested in federal law. So they should have been upheld that whole time, right? They should have been the highest law of the land. They should have been protected, but they weren't. And so then when the dams came down, it was this moment of deep healing. And the first dam that I saw, that was gone, and I write about this in the book, I just cried. I just deeply, deeply cried. And I was with the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, which is the dam removal entity board of directors. And, there I am just sobbing. So it was a little bit embarrassing, but at the same time, I really felt, that deep inherited anger, that intergenerational trauma that so many Native people feel. I felt it starting to heal, like it was coming out in those tears, because the fight that my family, that Indigenous peoples from the Klamath had kept up ever since, colonization, we were finally starting to recover. And, seeing those dams come down, it was the ultimate symbolic action of recovery and hope for the future. And so it was just so deeply healing.
Right. All right, that's Amy Bowers-Cordalis. She is the author of a new book called The Water Remembers, which documents her multi-generational fight, the tribe's multi-generational fight to save the river and save the salmon. I want to bring in our next two guests here. They are in Billings, Montana. We have Ivy McDonald and Ivan McDonald. The sibling filmmakers directed Bring Them Home. They are Blackfeet. Welcome to The Menu, Ivy.
How you doing?
Good, thank you. And welcome to The Menu, Ivan.
Hello, Dominic Scanastini.
I want to start with Ivy here. Ivy, what was your connection to the buffalo like when you were growing up on the Blackfeet Reservation? That'll give us a lot of context here to the documentary.
Yeah, so me and Ivan both grew up traditional Blackfeet, so we knew sort of, obviously the culture around the the ceremonies and what it means to be Blackfeet and what it means to live with buffalo. But there was never really buffalo on the reservation. It was only just through our learning it through our ceremonies and stuff, where that was kind of my connection for buffalo first started.
And Ivy, around that time, the tribe was actually making strides to bring buffalo back. Did you know about these efforts?
No, I wasn't. Like, I knew there was efforts to bring back buffalo, but I didn't know the extent of it until I started working on bringing them home and learning about all of the programs, all of the things going on. And, I didn't realize pretty much my whole family was working on bringing buffalo back. So it was a very big surprise when I started working on the project and realizing, like, oh, this has been going on for so long.
Mm-hmm. Ivan, could you take us through a little bit of a timeline of buffalo revitalization in Blackfeet territory? How did the buffalo actually come back to the territory?
Yeah. So this has been kind of, well, I would say probably like officially kind of documented 60 or 70 year history of the tribe of the Blackfeet trying to bring back bison in some capacity. Within the film, we kind of examined that history of the tribe kind of starting this process sometime around the 60s of getting a wild herd from Yellowstone, putting it on the reservation and kind of letting it loose and giving a kind of this really historic cowboy on the reservation, Mouse Hall, the ability to manage the herd. And throughout that kind of cycle, there was cycle where the tribe or some sort of entity would bring bison back to the reservation. They would probably last like a year, 2 years, maybe 3 years tops. And this is kind of a process that had went through from that point to kind of the current iteration. There was efforts in the 80s, there was efforts in the 90s, the 2000s, and it wasn't really until the later part of the 2000s, the early 2010s, where the INI initiative started, and INI is the Blackfeet word for bison, where there was a kind of a, in the film, again, we explain it kind of this way of the people who were tasked with creating the INI initiative and creating this herd. They really realized that this has to be a grassroots community-led effort. It's all of the efforts up to then had been led by council, had been led by leaders of the tribe, and so they really realized that to make this kind of a thing that the Blackfeet people want and to make it a need that the Blackfeet need to realize, we need to start at the community level. And so that was a big thing with the INI initiative. And about 15 years later, maybe 16 years later, the INI initiative is still the most long-standing revitalization effort on the reservation, and they're the ones who led the charge to have that wild herd established.
Got it. Okay, you're mentioning, some of those hurdles, and from the film, we learned that politics and land ownership were a really big barrier to buffalo being brought back to Blackfeet land. Ivan, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, as many of us know, and as in quote unquote Indian country, land, politics, bureaucracy, kind of all of these things have kind of impeded a lot of efforts, and particularly within relation to the bison, it was kind of that similar thing. Most of the revenue in most of the land used on the tribe on the Blackfeet reservation up until maybe about 5 years or so was allocated to cattle ranching, and cattle ranching in some aspects is the, whatever way you chop it, is kind of this antithesis of bison, and kind of bison, kind of the ways in which bison exist. Bison are very migratory, they're very free roaming, and kind of to have the reservation divided up by fences and land and land ownership and whatnot, it proved a really pertinent kind of issue as to why the efforts took so long. And so the tribe, again, they kind of identified some of these issues and realized early on, okay, well, where is this piece of protected land and large enough to host bison? where could that be done on the reservation? And so they identified this really interesting part of the reservation called Nonostiku, or Chief Mountain, where it's bordered by Glacier National Park, it's bordered by the Blackfeet Reservation, it's bordered by Canada, but it's this large kind of sacred, really kind of sacred place on the reservation. And they worked with Glacier National Parks, they worked with the Canada, Parks to Canada, and were able to kind of establish this area and establish this, what they call Yellow Mountain Conservation Area. And that's kind of the efforts. You know, that was a big thing too, where they had to retire cattle leases up in that area. There was some instances where non-tribal members and non-Blackfeet would sign contracts or sign agreements for these 1,000-acre leases and put just a few bit of cattle on there, and it would get overgrazed. And so there was a lot of these kind of, and I think, I think these efforts really hopefully tried to rectify some of the more long-standing land ownership, land tenure issues on the reservation. There was a huge ranch that was owned by some owner of some major baseball, the American Baseball League, or whatever the acronym is for that. And, the tribe was able to purchase and kind of reclaim his ranch after he had left, and used part of that to establish that conservation area. And they also took down part of the fences, because that's a huge thing with regards to the migratory patterns of bison, is that fences are really they really impede and really hinder bison movement. And so there was as we kind of examined in the film, there was all of these really kind of infrastructure and kind of foundational and kind of, really kind of these hoops that the tribe jumped through. But I think really the way in which they approached it, where it was kind of this collaborative approach between the government, the state, the federal, the tribe, I really think that's what kind of helped in the long run to kind of establish this long-term vision.
Okay. I want to hear from the documentary, which is Bring Them Home. The film includes some footage from a 1993 blockade preventing buffalo from reaching the Blood Reserve in Canada.
Why do you want to stop the buffalo? Dictatorship.
And it was just based on a communication thing. And in fact, our Sacred Buffalo Women's Society, we're trying to help them come home.
Okay, then why are you standing up for my people? Why are you blocking standing our up for the majority of the people under it? We are the people too.
The buffalo were sent back the next day, never to return.
The best that I can gather is that we were not ready. It was like if somebody talked about the past, they would be laughed at, because boarding school taught them that those ways were gone and they had to go forward.
That was the voice of Paulette Fox, who is a buffalo advocate from the Blood Tribe. And you also heard Lily Gladstone there. The documentary also teaches us about the collaboration among the Blackfeet Confederacy, which, a couple of reserves in Canada, and then the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. Ivy, I want to go back to you. As a filmmaker, you got to be around the buffalo that you were filming. What was that experience like for you?
It was probably one of the most amazing things I think I've ever done as a filmmaker, just feeling them around you, seeing them look at you, seeing them, run here. One of my favorite scenes of the film, but one of my favorite experiences I've ever had in my life was doing the Buffalo Drive, bringing them one side of the reservation to the other, to their winter pasture or their spring pasture. That was probably, I think for me as a cinematographer, just capturing their image and, the powerfulness of them. I think that, you feel their souls, you feel them running alongside you. I was driving a side by side and there was a massive herd of buffalo just, feet from me. And that was just like, I don't know, it was the most amazing thing in the world.
The film brings us all the way up to about mid-2023. How are the buffalo now? Give us an update, Ivy.
So the buffalo now, they're kind of back where they started, due to border things across the border, Canadian ranchers, saying if they come on their land, we're going to kill them right there, due to, some circumstances, but they're all kind of back in the middle of the reservation now. And there are efforts to put them back out there at some point, but, kind of like how we say in the film, end in time is when it will happen. So we're just kind of waiting at this point.
Okay. And Ivan, are you guys working on another film, another maybe Blackfeet related film or project?
Yeah, Ivy and I are always kind of working on something. And our current project, we've had this longer standing project about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis through the lens of our community and also through the lens of our family. And so that too is a PBS project and will be out on PBS hopefully sometime, if not the end of next year, beginning of next, or sometime in 2027. And all of our projects, we've been so lucky where our community, our people, our tribe has continuously invited us back to collaborate and share stories. And so Ivy and I are always really, really trying to push and share Blackfeet stories. And, I think I'm just so lucky to be able to do that as a career.
All right. The film is called Bring Them Home, and it is now on PBS if you're interested in watching and learning about buffalo restoration in the Blackfeet country. That is all the time we have for our show today. I'd like to say thank you to our guests that we heard from: Carly Griffith-Hotfit, Amy Bowers-Cordalis, and Ivan and Ivy McDonald. Join us tomorrow for a wrap-up of Native Film and TV. I'm Andy Murphy.
Every family caregiver could use help finding the necessary resources to care for their loved one. The AARP Family Caregiver Resource Guide helps family caregivers access key programs, services, and agencies in their communities. A copy of the guide is available by calling 877-333-5885 or online at aarp.org/caregiverresources. AARP supports this show. Repatriation is the return of ancestors and stolen culture. The Association on American Indian Affairs is hosting the 11th annual Repatriation Conference, Feeding the Fire, Advancing the Movement, in February 2026. This fully virtual conference will offer small group interactive workshops, strategies, networking, and more to advance domestic and international repatriation. More at indian-affairs.org. The association supports this show.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Quantic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.